Hey guys, welcome to week one of Jesus Is. I hope you guys are staying safe and you're finding new ways to stay busy and entertain yourself, and that you are still loving your family. I've missed you guys, but I'm super excited about this series as we kick off with week one. And so I just want to jump right in here to this new series called Jesus Is, with a question mark at the end. So my first question I want to start off for you is, have you ever had to forgive someone before? Think about it. In fact, pause the video if you need to, and I want you just to stop and think, when was the time that you had to forgive someone? Think about that, and then tune back in, okay? Got it? Great. Okay. Hopefully you're back now and you haven't answered that. Now I want you to think about a time when you had to ask for forgiveness from someone. Think about that. If you need to, pause the video, think about it. When was the time that you had to ask for forgiveness from someone? All right? Got it? Cool. All right, those are important because forgiveness is not always easy, and the circumstances around it can get really messy and hurtful. And so here's the last initial question I want to ask is this: is it easier for you to forgive someone or to ask someone for forgiveness? What do you think? I'm curious to know. Feel free to put it in the comments, mention it. Do you think it is easier for you to forgive someone or to ask someone forgiveness? That's the question. And so you may be thinking, okay, Brian, you said the title was Jesus Is. What does this have to do with forgiveness? Well, we're getting there. And to help maybe us get there, I want to start by sharing a story about a time I was in eighth grade. And my family, we always went camping all the time. We loved camping. And we would always go camping with my mom's parents. So my grandma and grandpa, we would go camping. And my grandpa was in the military. And so he was a very direct uh, person. He would tell you what he was thinking, and you better listen and obey him. And so I was always cautious to be obedient to my grandpa. But I loved my grandpa. He was a great man. Well, we went camping, and I brought a friend of mine. His name was Ricky, one of my friends growing up. I brought him with me to go camping to have a buddy. And this was during basketball season, and I had uh, I had the worst case of athlete's foot I've ever had in my life. I didn't have it often, maybe only a couple other times playing sports growing up. But this was the worst case of athlete's foot I'd ever had. And I'm not joking when I tell you, like I was using three different kinds of medicine, and my feet were peeling incredibly bad. I mean, my socks always had, I know this is gross, had dead skin all over in it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the smell. I'm not joking when I tell you, if I took my shoes off, it didn't matter how big the room was. When I took my shoes off, I fumigated the entire room with this wretched, awful, rank smell of feet. Okay, it was the most potent smell ever, and everyone knew it, and everyone was what was wrong. So I was really embarrassed. So all that to say, we were camping, and it was late at night, and my grandparents had like a pop-up camper, and so we decided we were going to play cards because it was kind of colder out. We were going to go into their camper and play some cards. So me, my friend Ricky, and my grandma and my mom, we were playing cards. Well, it was kind of later at night. My grandpa would always go to bed early, and so my grandpa had made the decision he was going to go to bed, and then we were playing cards, so we were kind of staying quiet or whatever, that we were being sensitive to him. Well, when you know it, my feet start to itch so bad, and if you've ever had athlete's foot, it can itch really bad. And I was like, I was doing everything I could to itch my foot inside my shoe. Well, finally, I had enough. I had to take my shoes off and itch them, and I took them off. It was only maybe for like 10 seconds, just to get a good scratch, and I put them back on. So we're playing cards, and by this point, it was like a split second, and immediately the whole camper was fumigated with this terrible feet smell. I mean, it was bad. Even my friend, everybody, it was like, "What's that smell?" And then I had to tell him, like, "I'm sorry, it's my feet. I've got athlete's foot. I know it smells terrible. I had to scratch it. I'm so sorry." Well, it just kept getting worse and worse, even though my shoes were on. Here's the funny part. So we're playing cards, and all of a sudden, my grandpa barrels out of the sleeping quarters of the camper, and he's just in his underwear. Okay, I had never seen my grandpa in his underwear before, but he was in his underwear and he was mad. I mean, red face, and he comes out and he says, "Good Lord, what is that smell?" And so initially, I mean, we all knew what it was, and I had never seen my grandpa act that way, let alone in his underwear. And so we're busting out laughing. Well, that didn't help anything at all. It only made him madder. And through my laughter, in fact, when I was younger, when I didn't know how to handle situations, I would laugh. In fact, it got me in trouble even more because I would laugh. And it wasn't that I was trying to be disrespectful. I just emotionally, I didn't know how to handle the situation. And so I would laugh. Well, this is one of those moments. I'm laughing because and it is kind of funny, but I had never seen my grandpa act that way, and I was kind of like, "Yo, dude, you're in your underwear. Like, what are you doing?" And so through my laughter, I try to tell him it's my feet, and he's like, then he just gets really kind of mean, and he starts yelling at me and talking and threatening me, and he tells me get out of my camper. And he kicked me out, and I had never had my grandpa talk to me that way, let alone in front of a friend. And I just remember walking out of the camper shaking because while my friend thought it was funny, and part of it was funny, I had just I had never been talked to that way. I'd never been kicked out of the camper, and this was something that I really didn't feel like I could help, even though I felt terrible about it. And so I got kicked out of his camper. And for the rest of the camping trip, I kind of felt weird around my grandpa, like I didn't know how to act. And so keep all that in context. Well, 2 weeks goes by, and our house phone rings. So before I had a cell phone or anything, our house phone rings, and I answer it, and this man on the other end with this really weird high pitched voice was like, "Hello, is Brian there?" And I'm like, "Yeah, this is him." And then it dawned on me, like, this is Grandpa. Like, what is he talking all funny for? And he starts talking about some stuff, and then he's like, "Hey, did you go camping recently?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he's like, was there anything that happened that that made you feel weird?" And I kind of didn't know what he was getting at because I was in eighth grade. I didn't understand. And then slowly the conversation shifted into him talking about what had happened. And again, my grandpa was a military man. He was tough and strong. And and in that conversation, it dawned on me what he was trying to do was he was trying to ask for forgiveness, but it was extremely hard and painful for him. You could tell it was tough, but his heart was hurting because he knew he had treated me wrong. He had hurt me. He had embarrassed me in front of my family and my friend, um, and that I could just knew that was eating him up. And so he basically he with a disguised voice because he didn't know how to act, he asked for my forgiveness, and I told him, "Grandpa, I love you. I forgive you." Um, I thanked him for the call, and we said goodbye. And so I just share that story with you because it was a personal story of a time where I had to forgive someone who was asking for forgiveness. And so here's the thing about forgiveness: when you mess up, the only person who can forgive you is the person you harmed, right? My grandpa didn't call it my brother or my dad to ask for forgiveness. No, my grandpa called me because it was me that had offended, had been offended and hurt. And that's how forgiveness works. And so we've all had experiences with forgiveness. Maybe you're thinking right now about a time that you were forgiven, or a time you forgave someone, or maybe even a time that you chose not to forgive someone. You're maybe thinking about those moments right now as I share that story and you're relating to it. So maybe you're struggling right now to forgive or ask for forgiveness from someone else. Because forgiveness is something we often need to give as well as receive. And I want us to learn from somebody today who knows a lot about forgiveness. You guessed it, that person's Jesus. And so I wanted to ask you a question, okay? Who is Jesus to you? Think about it. Who is Jesus to you? So finish this sentence. Jesus is fill in the blank. Pause the video if you need to. Think about it. Jesus is fill in the blank. Pause it, get an answer, and then come back. Okay? Got it? Cool. Next question. Who would people at your school say Jesus is? If they answered the fill in the blank question, what would they fill that blank with? Who would they say Jesus is? Okay? Pause the video if you need to. Think about it. Who they would say Jesus is, and then come back to the video. Awesome. You're back. So people have always had questions about Jesus, who Jesus is. All throughout history, ever since Jesus walked the earth over 2,000 years ago, they've all had the question, who is Jesus? And when Jesus was still here on earth, he knew people were wondering who he was. And so one day he asked his disciples what they thought. And so in Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 through 16, here's what it says. I want to read it for you. Verse 13, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. But then Jesus in verse 15, he says this. He says, but what about you? He asked, who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Okay, and that's important. And so the disciples responded with a whole list of possible answers to Jesus' question. According to them, people thought Jesus was John the Baptist, or maybe Elijah, or possibly Jeremiah, or one of the other prophets in the Old Testament. In other words, people thought Jesus was a good teacher or a religious leader. Okay, and that's significant because that's who others thought Jesus was. And so if you're not sure what a prophet is, it's simply a person who speaks to God and for God. Okay, that's what a prophet is. And so in a sense, these people were right. Jesus does, in fact, speak to and for God. He was well known by everyone at this point, okay? But they weren't exactly right. You see, Jesus isn't just another prophet who speaks to and for God. Here's the big idea, okay? This is the Jesus is fill in the blank. Here's the truth that I want you to get. The big idea of this whole message is that Jesus is God, okay? And some of you are like, whoa, that's a big statement. But this is the truth. If you've been reading the Bible and you haven't figured it out yet, Jesus is God. Spoiler alert, Jesus is God. And so after his disciples answered his question, Jesus asked another question. And this time he didn't want to know what other people thought about him. He wanted to know what his closest friends, his followers, his disciples thought about him. And that he wanted to know, who do you think I am? And so Peter said he believed that Jesus was two things. Number one, he said, you are the Messiah. And so the Messiah is a word used to talk about someone who would save God's people. All throughout the Old Testament, there were prophecies about the Messiah who would come and save and redeem God's chosen people, the nation of Israel. Okay? And so Peter was saying that Jesus, I believe you are the Messiah. You're the one who was prophesied to come. Okay? And we'll talk about that more next week. But the other thing that Peter said about Jesus was that he said that Jesus was the Son of the living God. And that's a big statement, okay? And so others thought Jesus was God, but did Jesus himself claim that he was God? I think that's the next logical question. So other people would say Jesus is God based on his miracles and everything else, but did Jesus himself say he was God? Well, in Mark chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, I highly encourage you to read it. It's an awesome story. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit for you what takes place. But essentially, Jesus is famous. He's walking and traveling, going to city to town, and he's healing and doing these miraculous signs, okay? He has the whole world's attention. Who is this man? Okay, they're all asking that question. So he's doing all these miracles, and he's in this region, and he's in this building, okay, that is packed. It's jam-packed with people. Well, there's this paralyzed man. You've probably heard this story before. It's an amazing story. And he's got these 4 friends who are really good friends. And they're trying to help him. They know that Jesus can heal. He's healed people of their disease. He's helped people who couldn't walk again. He's restored sight. He's done all these incredible, amazing miracles, okay? And they love their friend. And so they're like, we've got to get our bro in there, and Jesus will heal him. But the problem was the place was so packed they couldn't get in. So what do? They decide they're going to climb on top of the roof, break open the roof of this building that they're in, this place that they're meeting in, and they lower their friend down to Jesus, okay? So that's what's happening in this. And so we're going to jump to Mark chapter 2, verse 5, okay? I kind of paraphrase a little bit of the background story. But this is what Jesus says, or what it says happens here in verse 5. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralyzed man, you ready for this? Here's what he says. Son, your sins are forgiven. And so imagine for a moment, can you imagine being paralyzed your whole life, and you finally get this chance to meet Jesus, who you have heard that he's healed other people, that he's done miracles. This is crazy. And you're paralyzed. You're like, heck yeah, I want to meet Jesus. He can fix my legs. He can help me to walk again. He can change my whole life. And so when you get to him, you're ready for this moment, you've dreamed about it, you're finally there, your friends helped you get there, and you're ready to be healed, and he looks at you and he says, your sins are forgiven. Well, forgiveness wasn't really what the paralyzed man wanted. And if you were in that situation, that's probably not what you're thinking you wanted. You'd be like, well, thanks, Jesus. I appreciate you forgiving me. But really, why I was here was for you to fix my legs or to help me walk again. I think that's probably what we'd all be thinking. He wanted to walk again. But I want to finish the rest of the passage here to give some more context, okay? So in verse 6, he says, now some teachers of the law were sitting there. They saw all this happen, okay? They were sitting there and thinking to themselves, why does this fellow talk like that? So they're talking about Jesus. Why does he talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? That's very important. They know the only person who can forgive someone's sins is God. And so who is this Jesus guy to assume that he can forgive sins when that's only the role and place that God can do? Great question. Verse 8, immediately Jesus knew in his spirit that this was what they were thinking in their hearts. That's what they were thinking. And he said to them, why are you thinking these things? Which is easier to say to this paralyzed man, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up, take your mat, and walk? In verse 10, he says, but I want you to know that the Son of Man, which is Jesus, has authority on earth to forgive sins. And so he said to the man, I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home. Verse 12 says, he got up, took his mat, and walked out in full view of them all. This amazed everyone, and they praised God, saying, we have never seen anything like this. Okay? So this is a very important story that historically took place, all right? And so a few minutes ago, I said that when you hurt someone, the only person who can forgive you is the person you harmed or the person who harmed you if you're getting forgiveness from them. Like my example of the story of my grandpa, why I shared about that. My grandpa didn't call my brother or my dad. Remember, he called me because I was the only one that he had offended, and I was the only one who could give him the forgiveness that he sought. And so by offering forgiveness to this man, going back to the story of Jesus and this paralyzed man, Jesus is letting everyone who saw this know that this paralyzed man had done something to offend Jesus. But what? And so to understand that, you need to understand this. Because God created everything, you, me, the whole world, and everyone in it, anytime we harm ourselves, others, or the world that we live in, we're actually harming God and hurting him. We are committing an offense against him because God created all of it. And so all sin is really a sin against God. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. And that time you cheated on your test, or you punched your brother, or you talked back to your parents, yeah, those were sins against God, not just against them, but God because he created everything. And so that's kind of the bad news. But the good news here is that because every sin is a sin against God, God has the authority to forgive every sin. So that's the good news. And so when Jesus tells this man that his sins are forgiven, he's making a big statement. This is big stuff because it's really talking about who Jesus is. He's saying, I'm not just a good teacher. My authority comes from God because, you ready for this? I am God. That's what Jesus is saying, that he is God by proclaiming that he can forgive this man's sin, which means he can forgive our sin because he is God. And then to prove his point, Jesus told the paralyzed man to get up and walk, healing him completely. And so not just spiritually, but physically too. And that's why Jesus didn't just say, hey, I'm going to heal you and go about your way. He wanted everyone to know who he really was. And that's why he said, your sins are forgiven, which was the more important thing to do rather than just help him walk. Because even after he dies, his legs won't be any good. He'll still have a sin. The greater thing that Jesus could have given him was forgiveness for his sin. And then to show that he really was God, he healed him. That's important. So who is Jesus? This story, in Jesus' own words, make it pretty clear that Jesus is God. That's what we want you to get out of this first message of the 4-week series. Jesus is God, okay? So we'll wrap it up here. So the logical question to ask is, if Jesus is God, then what should we do about it? If he really is God, like the scriptures say he is, what should we do about it? So the question you should be asking yourself is, if Jesus is God, I will what? I will fill in the blank. If Jesus is God, I will. What does that mean? Because that should change our whole outlook on our life and the way we live. And so I want you to pause the video and think about that for a little bit. If Jesus is God, I will And you answer that question. If Jesus really is God, then it should change everything about our lives and our faith. Maybe knowing Jesus is God has already changed your life, or maybe you're not sure what you think about that just yet. But no matter where you are in your faith journey, okay, I hope this week you hear and consider how this one claim can change your whole life if it is true. The truth that Jesus is God. So if Jesus is God, it changes everything. It's a game changer. So here's my question for you as we kind of close up week 1 of this series. Who do you say Jesus is? That's an important question. Maybe the most important question you'll ever ask in your whole life. Who is Jesus to you? And if he is who he claims to be, how can it change your life? How could it change your life? I hope that has been a challenge to you. I hope these 2 passages that we look at has spoken to you and gives you something to think about. Jesus is fill in the blank. Every single person will have to answer that question at some point in their life. And my hope, our hope, is that you see Jesus to be who he claimed to be, that he is God, because he had the ability to forgive sins as well as heal people. And so I hope that gives you a new perspective of who Jesus is. I hope you interact with your I-Team this week throughout the I-Team discussion questions as you talk more about who is Jesus to you, and then how does that mean we should live. It's some challenging stuff for all of us. And so I'm super excited about this series. I hope you engage with your I-Team. Definitely, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comment of the video or send me a text or an email or DM me on Facebook or Instagram. We'd love to stay connected with you throughout this series. All right? You guys stay safe. We love you and can't wait to see you back for next week for week 2 of our series, Jesus Is. All right? We'll see you.